for more insight on the implications of recognizing a Palestinian state and what we can expect from this year's General Assembly as the UN marks its 80th year, let's speak with Charles Kupchan. He's Senior Fellow with the Council on Foreign Relations. Professor, it is good to have you back on the show. Thank you very much for joining us. I want to start by asking you about what the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer said. He insisted recognition is not a reward because it means Hamas can have no future, no role in government, no role in security, for the Palestinian state. I'm wondering if that is realistic given popular support for the group. Okay, I'm not sure whether or not that has been maintained given what's happened. It's seen as heavy-handed, but also more responsive, to Palestinians' needs compared to the Palestinian Authority and Fatah.
Yeah, I think that Prime Minister Starmer was in some ways hedging because he's going out on a limb of sorts by recognizing Palestinian statehood, breaking with President Trump in the United States on the issue. And one of the critiques that you're getting from the Israelis is this is a reward to Hamas. And as a consequence, I think the Prime Minister is saying this is not a reward to Hamas. We don't want Hamas to have any role in governing Gaza once the violence comes to an end. But I think the bigger picture here is that there is a new level of diplomatic isolation of Israel. Many of the countries so far that have recognized Palestinian statehood are in the global south. Now you have leading members of the United Nations, including France, probably coming up in the next few days, Britain, members of the Security Council, moving ahead. Doesn't really change anything on the ground because Israel seems determined to keep pushing to destroy Hamas. But isolation, I think, is the key word here looking forward and when it comes to Israel.
Do you see this isolation or recognition influencing Israel policy in any way, or could it backfire by deepening Netanyahu's resolve to expand settlements or annex parts of West Bank, for example?
I think, Julie, in the short term, it's going to deepen the resolve of Netanyahu and his right-wing cabinet to double down on trying to get rid of Hamas. And that's probably not going to work because Hamas is a political movement, not just a military organization. And it may encourage the government to push harder on annexing parts of the West Bank or increasing settlement blocks on the West Bank. In the longer term, once Netanyahu leaves the scene, and he will eventually leave the scene, I do think that you may see a center emerge within Israeli politics that may be more ready to move on the question of self-determination for Palestinians. And if you have a leader ready to do that, then pointing out that Israel is isolated, that some of its key allies in the world have recognized Palestinian statehood, in the long run, that may affect the outcome of this debate, but not now.
Professor Kupchan, just to elaborate on that point, some countries, including the UK and Australia, believe a two-state solution is a necessary precursor for lasting peace. Others, like the US, maybe aren't so sure because things have been changing. There are territorial changes in the West Bank, for example. The political dynamics are also changing. So I'm wondering, do you believe a two-state solution is necessary for peace, or is the Israeli vision, which is, I guess, becoming increasingly more popular, of limited autonomy, a more realistic version?
I think in the end, there's no alternative to a two-state solution because there is no one-state solution, right? A one-state solution means a population that is majority Palestinian, and a Jewish state is not willingly going to hand over power to those that they see as an enemy, at least for now. And so I do think that if this conflict is going to end, ultimately there needs to be Palestinian self-determination. Whether this is a full-on state, as we think about most states, or a state that has limited powers because Israel retains a certain measure of control over security, over borders, that remains to be seen. But I do think in the end of the day, in part for Israel's survival as a secure democracy, in the end, there has to be a state for the Palestinians that live there.
And Professor, as we head into the UN General Assembly and with the UN marking its 80th anniversary, is the UN, with rules and structures set back in 1945, still relevant to resolving conflicts like Israel and Hamas? Or does this crisis expose its limits and need for a major reform?
You know, I think that the United Nations has been a remarkably effective international organization, a global parliament of sorts. Since its founding, it's delivered humanitarian aid, it does peacekeeping, it deals with a whole host of issues on a day-to-day basis, and at the same time, it is a grand failure. If you look at the UN going back to the Cold War, it was paralyzed because of the US and the Soviet veto. There was a period in the 1990s and the decade after when the UN began to address the big issues of the day, such as the war between Iraq and Kuwait, got more engaged in peacekeeping during this period. But now we're back in a geopolitically divided world where you have the United States and its allies on one side, Russia and China on the other side. The UN is paralyzed. It is not really taking a position at all on Gaza, on Ukraine, on Sudan, the three big wars that are burning as we speak. And in some ways, I think what you're seeing here is a UN that struggles to remain relevant on those big geopolitical issues, even with reform, even with new members on the Security Council. The UN is always going to fall short of the great parliament providing global governance that its founders had thought they were building.
So, Professor, then do you still believe there's a place for it? I mean, we've talked about this last year. It was the UN Security Council. The year before, it was also the UNSC. Likewise, 3 years ago. So where does it leave us? Because the UN Security Council is, I guess, the forum where wars are stopped, conflicts are resolved, and things like statehood are decided as well.
You know, if the UN didn't exist, we would need to create it. And there's no question that the UN needs to be reformed. We still have a UN Security Council for 1945, right? It's now 2025. There has to be Security Council enlargement. There need to be new permanent members. There needs to be greater representation from the global South. But a larger Security Council is probably a more unwieldy Security Council. More voices at the table, more differences of opinion. And so I do think that we're still going to be in a world in which the UN, because of the Security Council and the veto, remains paralyzed on the big ticket issues of the day. And as a consequence, I think we need to look for alternative vehicles, small groups that come together to deal with climate change, with US-China competition, with the war in Gaza, because I think the UN has inherent intrinsic limits that will never really be resolved.
Okay, Professor Kupchan, always great to have you on the show. Thank you very much for your time. Charles Kupchan, Senior Fellow of Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you.